It is 2 o'clock, so we'll go ahead and get started. I just want to, my name is Leslie Bobby. I'm the lead for Southern Regional Extension Forestry, and I'll be hosting this webinar today on the Forestry webinar portal. I assume most of you have found out about this webinar through our subscription list, but if not, you can go to forestrywebinars.net and you can subscribe in the bottom right-hand side. There's a subscription area. Just a few housekeeping notes. If you are intending to get continuing education credits for this webinar, make sure you keep the second screen open that says start, view, and complete the webinar. At the end of this webinar, when the Zoom show ends, then you'll go back to that screen and press complete the webinar, which will complete the process and allow you to get the continuing education credits. If you do have any problems, you can contact us via a button on the website. I'm going to ask everyone to ask questions via the Q&A. And after Hilary's presentation, then I'll read the questions out loud and we'll find the answers from there. And this is the way you subscribe to the webinar portal. So welcome everybody, and we'll go ahead and get started. I'll hand it over to Hilary. And Hilary, I'm going to stop sharing my screen now, so I'll let you share again.
All right, will do. Hi, folks. I'm so happy to be here. Thanks, Leslie, for the invitation. My name is Hilary Morris. I work on behalf of a conservation partnership called the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy, or CCAS. And I'm here to talk about the primary product of CCAS, which is the Southeast Conservation Blueprint, and some of the resources that are available to help you connect this big regional data set to some of your local scale work. So my role with CCAS is as the communications lead for our conservation partnership. I also work on what we call user support. So it's my job to help anyone who wants to incorporate the blueprint into their work. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that entails as we get further along. So CCAS, as I said, stands for the Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy. And we're a regional conservation partnership that spans 15 states of the Southeast, as well as Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands, and the surrounding marine environment. CCAS was started in 2011 by the states of the Southeastern Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies and the federal agencies who are working on natural resource conservation in the Southeast region. We also have representatives from a handful of nonprofit organizations as well. So all the organizations that you see represented here designate a point of contact that participates in CCAS decision-making. What does CCAS do? We set a bold vision and an ambitious goal for what we want the conservation future of our region to look like. We design and help facilitate implementation of a blueprint for action that shows how we're going to achieve that vision and goal. And then we do really whatever we can to clear barriers to cross-state collaboration. The vision for CCAS is a connected network of lands and waters that supports thriving fish and wildlife populations and improved quality of life for people. And because that vision is pretty aspirational, we also have this more measurable goal for what we're trying to accomplish, and that is a 10% or greater improvement in the health, function, and connectivity of southeastern ecosystems by the year 2060. That's pretty long term, so to tell whether we're on track to meet that goal in shorter timelines, we do step that down with these interim metrics of a 1% improvement in ecosystem health, function, and connectivity every 4 years, and a corresponding increase in conservation actions within the blueprint, which we'll talk about in a second. To track progress toward achieving the goal, typically every year we release what we call the CCAS Goal Report that tracks recent trends in southeastern ecosystems. It essentially takes the most recent available monitoring data from existing Southeast-wide monitoring programs and computes a trend in a series of indicators that collectively represent ecosystem health, function, and connectivity. So the idea here is that the goal report makes it possible for us to see at a glance, really, what is the collective impact of our shared conservation work as a community? What are we getting for all the work that we're putting in? What are the indicators that are on track to meet the goal, where all we need to do is keep up the good work? What are the indicators that are actually in a little bit of trouble? They might be falling through the cracks, and we might need to invest more time and attention to turn that trend around. So our hope is that this will help sort of galvanize some conversations about trade-offs and what might be falling through the cracks. That brings us to the primary product of CCAS and the main thing I'm going to talk about today, which is the Southeast Conservation Blueprint. The blueprint is a living spatial plan, a map that identifies priority areas for that connected network of lands and waters that's called for in the CCAS vision. Across most of the geography, it's based on a suite of indicators representing natural and cultural resources. They represent terrestrial, freshwater, and coastal and marine ecosystems. And it also incorporates a least cost path connectivity analysis that helps really depict that connected network. So what you're seeing here is that 50% of the lands and waters of our region is prioritized in the blueprint and is some shade of purple on this map. A few things that I always encourage folks to keep in mind when they look at the blueprint for the first time. This is a map that identifies areas where you might take a range of different conservation actions like management, restoration, economic incentives with private landowners, and protection. But this isn't just a map for land acquisition. The blueprint is very much a work in progress, and we're very open about that. We're always looking to incorporate new data, input from new partners, and better information about what conditions are really like on the ground. We update the blueprint every year. And in fact, we publish a list of what we call known issues with each version of the blueprint that documents everything the blueprint isn't doing as well as we'd like that we're aware of. And we use that to prioritize the improvements that are most important in the next version. And then lastly, the blueprint is very much intended to provide a regional perspective and to be used in combination with local data and knowledge. So I'm never getting up at webinars like this and saying, drop what you're doing, use the blueprint instead. It is not one plan to rule them all. The blueprint is very much intended to provide that regional lens and to be used in a complementary way with the local data and knowledge that you're already using. I want to touch a little bit on how the blueprint has evolved over time, because we're kind of getting to the tail end of a really big set of improvements. And I want you to kind of see how this approach has grown and changed. So back in 2020, this is how we built the Southeast Blueprint, by stitching together all of these different sub-regional plans, almost like squares of a quilt. These plans typically covered sub-regional boundaries. If any of you might be familiar with the landscape conservation cooperatives or the LCC partnerships, many of these sub-regional inputs to the Southeast Blueprint were developed by these LCC partnerships. So we would stitch them together as best we could, kind of seaming them up around the boundaries to try to create this Southeast-wide blueprint. But we were getting a demand increasingly from users for a more consistent product where they really knew that they could make an apples to apples comparison between the data in Texas and the data in North Carolina to know that it was really all built on the same stack of data. And last year, we took a massive leap forward toward that goal in improving the consistency of the underlying methods and data that go into the blueprint. So we went from sort of this crazy mosaic to this much more streamlined approach, where the blueprint uses a consistent approach across all 15 states and that portion of the Atlantic marine environment that you see highlighted in green here. We often affectionately as staff refer to this as the base blueprint because it forms the base of the Southeast Blueprint. For this past year, we did still continue to stitch in the Florida marine blueprint to cover the marine environment around Florida, as well as the Caribbean landscape conservation design to cover Puerto Rico. Now, this is what we're building toward this year in 2023. We are expanding that consistent methodology, that consistent approach to the offshore marine environment of the Atlantic Ocean and Gulf of Mexico and to Puerto Rico and the US Virgin Islands. So we're really excited about this because we've actually never had coverage of the blueprint in the US Virgin Islands before, and the Puerto Rico priorities were really due to be updated. We've also never had full coverage of the Atlantic marine environment or outside of state waters in the Gulf. So very excited about this new round of improvements for this year. But for now, we're going to talk about the current version, which is Blueprint 2022. So this is how Blueprint 2022 works. If you kind of peek under the hood, here's how it all comes together. So we start with that suite of natural and cultural resource indicators that I mentioned. We have 37 indicators in total. These include things like intact habitat cores, looking at large unfragmented patches of natural habitat, things like fire frequency, where is prescribed fire being regularly used, the data from TNC's Resilient and Connected Landscapes, both looking at resilience of terrestrial ecosystems and resilience of coastal ecosystems, where salt marshes will be able to migrate inland in response to rising sea levels. We also have aquatic indicators like imperiled aquatic species that looks at where aquatic species of greatest conservation need have been observed. And basically we pull all of those indicators together in a modeling process. We use a software framework called Zonation. And what zonation needs in the second step is edges to work from, because it's trying to create these big contiguous chunks of priority, create this connected network, and it needs these edges to kind of move in from. So we define the edges by removing highly altered areas. This essentially is like things like the highly developed areas of cities. And then what zonation does is it looks within a subregion and ranks each area within that subregion according to its importance for those indicators. So it basically looks at how all the indicators are scoring within, say, the Atlantic coastal plain. And it says, okay, let me take the pixel that's that worst place to conserve. What's the one that contributes the least to that suite of indicators? Chuck it out of the model and run it again and say, okay, now that I've gotten rid of that one, now what's the worst place to conserve? And it throws it out of the model. And so what you end up with is this continuous prioritization of each ranking of each pixel within a subregion from least important to most important for those indicators. And you can cut that prioritization off basically anywhere that you want. So we take roughly the top 50% or kind of the above average areas. So we take the output from zonation, this indicator-based prioritization, and then we add additional connectivity using a least cost path connectivity analysis. We do this in a program called Linkage Mapper. And essentially what we're doing is identifying big hubs. These are on the terrestrial side, large patches of protected lands and large patches of highest priority areas in the blueprint. On the marine side, we also have those large patches of high priority areas, as well as large estuaries, because we're trying to drive connectivity from the offshore to the nearshore environment. And then what Linkage Mapper does is it connects those hubs across the shortest distance possible, while also moving through as much blueprint priority as possible. That's how we really get that connected network, is by baking those blueprint priorities into the corridors. And then we combine that indicator-based prioritization from zonation and the corridors, glue them together. And that is what produces the base blueprint that covers that contiguous southeast area that I showed in green on the previous slide. Then we stitch in the Florida marine environment, we stitch in the Caribbean landscape conservation design, and that's what gives us the final southeast blueprint. Now, if you want to access all of this data, we try to make that really easy to do. The best place to start is on this blueprint page of the CCAS website, which is just ccassoutheast.org/blueprint. We'll see if I can manage to multitask and put this in the chat. I'm not sure I can chat all of the participants. I think I can just chat the host, but I've dropped that in. Maybe Leslie can share it for me.
Okay, yeah, I'll share it with everybody.
Thanks so much. So that's a great place to start. It'll give you good background information on the blueprint and how it was developed, in addition to links to the key pathways to access the blueprint data online. You will also find contact information for staff on the CCAS website, and I hope I will convince you by the end of this webinar that we would really like you to reach out to us for help. So the two main ways to access the blueprint data online, we have two viewers. One is called the Blueprint Explorer, and this is really our simplest, easiest place to start. It's just a point and click interface designed to help you discover how your area of interest is scoring in the blueprint and why, what indicators are driving that priority. My favorite feature of this viewer is you can actually upload your own shapefile and export a custom report. And when I say a custom report, I don't mean like a quick and dirty 2-pager with a bunch of boilerplate text. This is like a 50-page analysis of how the blueprint is scoring, how the indicators are scoring, how the hubs and corridors are scoring, how your area of interest is likely to be impacted by urban growth, by sea level rise. You'll get a map and a table of the number breakdown for each of those data sets. So it's really rich and there's a lot of information in there. You can also use what we call our CCAS Atlas, which is an ArcGIS online hub site. So if any of y'all are familiar with ArcGIS Online, you'll find a lot of the functionality that you're familiar with. This is a little bit more like an online alternative to your desktop GIS. So you can view individual data layers, read more about how they were developed, overlay layers to make maps. And of course, you have access to everything else that's on ArcGIS Online, whether it's your own data or data from other organizations that you want to pull into an analysis. You can do all of that there. Now, if you're just a GIS whiz and you want to download this data into your desktop GIS system and run with it, that is also totally fine. We serve up just a zip file with all of the data packaged up for you, the blueprint, the indicators, the connectivity analysis, all of the documentation on how the blueprint was developed in a zip file for you, so you can just download it and get started. But again, if you feel like, you know, I'm not sure about these viewers, I would really rather like work with a human being who knows this data and who can help me interpret it, that is totally fine. We have a staff of people dedicated to helping folks use the blueprint. That's what user support is all about. And we'll get into that a little bit more here. So we've talked about the products of CCAS, but I want to touch on our process a little bit as well, and some of the things that I think makes it a little bit unique. I mentioned that the blueprint is a work in progress and that we're always trying to improve it. That's in a large part because of our commitment to something called the lean startup method. And this is a business model that we sort of shamelessly borrowed from the tech world. It actually got its start with lean manufacturing at Toyota. And a lean startup is a lot like adaptive management. These are both these cycles where you kind of build something, you try it out, you measure how well it's working, you learn something, and then you try it again and try to use what you learned to refine and improve. The twist is lean startup is more of what we call adaptive management on steroids, because you're trying to move through that cycle as quickly and as cheaply as possible. The goal is to avoid wasting a bunch of time and money and resources on tools and data and products that don't really meet the needs of your user base. And in our case, our user base is the conservation community. So we really rely on feedback from folks like y'all to help drive this iterative blueprint improvement process. We get that feedback through things like our blueprint workshops, where anybody can come join and provide feedback on the draft blueprint before it's released, help us figure out what it's doing well, what it's missing. We have indicator teams where people can weigh in on resources that align with their area of expertise to make sure that we're representing them in the blueprint the right way. And then probably the biggest source of our feedback is from people who are actually using the blueprint to make decisions to strengthen their grant proposals. And that's another place where the role of user support becomes really important. We have a team of, I think, 7 people now dedicated to working with anybody who wants to use the blueprint in their work. We can make maps, we can write narratives, we can write letters of support for you to work into your grant proposals, help you kind of tell the story of how your project, the work that you're doing, connects to this larger strategy and communicate its benefits, sort of amplify the good work that you're already doing. We can help plug it into conservation plans, help you use it to inform your decisions. If you just want to brainstorm, how do I make this big regional data set relevant to my local work? We can help you with that. And we're certainly really motivated to help get the blueprint used and to actually connect the lands and waters of our region. That's what it's all about. But we also find that this approach really improves the quality of the blueprint and our online interfaces so much, because we learn an enormous amount about what it's doing well and what it's not, that we can use to drive our lean startup revision cycle. We also find that it really helps build trust. So when you work with people and really build those long-term relationships over time, and they can see, hey, yeah, the blueprint isn't perfect, it's got some issues, but I'm bought in and I believe that this will long-term meet my needs and I'm going to continue to participate. So that brings us to my favorite thing to talk about, which is how the blueprint is actually being used to make a difference on the ground. Like I said, this is a huge point of emphasis for us, and we do have these staff that are available to help you. This is what it's all about, because if the blueprint were the best plan in the world, if it were sitting on a shelf just gathering dust, that's not helping anyone. It's certainly not helping achieve the CCAS vision. So far, the blueprint has been used by more than 350 people from over 140 different organizations, and it's helped bring in more than $100 million in conservation funding to protect and restore more than 200,000 acres. If you want to see how those 140 organizations break down by sector, you can kind of see this here. We're really trying to work with a broad swath of the conservation community, that we obviously have some work to do in reaching some communities. I want to dig into a few stories of how the blueprint is being used so we can go a little bit more in depth. The first example I'll share, I saw there were some South Carolina folks on the line, so hopefully this will resonate with you all. I work a lot in South Carolina. It's the part of the CCAS geography that I probably work the most in, so I have a couple South Carolina stories in here. A few years ago, we were working with the South Carolina chapter of the Nature Conservancy, who was embarking on an update of what they call their South Carolina Conservation Vision, which is basically their map of conservation priorities across the state. And they wanted to anchor their vision on the Southeast Blueprint. So we worked with them to do that, basically helping them sort of filter the blueprint to focus on the big contiguous patches of priority, get rid of some of the smaller speckles, because they were really looking for these big chunks of focus areas that they could rally partners around. So we helped them with that and bringing in some additional data that they wanted to see represented that wasn't already in the blueprint. Then they were able to use their conservation vision to help advocate for the reauthorization of the South Carolina Conservation Bank, which is a big funding source and state agency for conservation in South Carolina. They used the blueprint and their vision to help make the case that the conservation community did have shared priorities. The community was prepared to speak with one voice. And there's a lot of really great, rigorous scientific data that the bank could use to be sure that it's really allocating its funding in a smart and replicable way. So once the bank did get successfully reauthorized, the Conservation Bank turned around and embarked on its own prioritization process, and it did end up using the blueprint in that as well as one of its ecological conservation priority layers. I like to mention this because I think it's a great example of using the blueprint in combination with other data, because the blueprint is just one small piece of this prioritization. There's also data on threatened and endangered species and wild and scenic rivers and historic rice fields and climate resilience and all sorts of great stuff in here. The blueprint's just sort of serving that role of that regional lens. Once the bank was reauthorized and had its own priorities identified, conservation partners in South Carolina started actually applying to the bank for funding. And one example of a project that did bring in some funding from the South Carolina Conservation Bank is with our user from South Carolina TNC, who used the blueprint to help bring in some funding to secure the Groton plantation. David Bishop with TNC brought in $850,000 from the South Carolina Conservation Bank to support this project, and another $500,000 from NIFWIF's Acres for America program. It was actually the first Acres for America grant ever awarded in South Carolina. And ended up successfully securing this amazing property, the Groton Plantation. It was the largest private easement in the history of South Carolina. Protecting this parcel created a protected corridor where wildlife could roam for 50 miles without ever leaving secured lands. This property had so many amazing natural resource values. It had red-cockaded woodpeckers, it had gopher tortoise, it had all of these game species like quail, just an incredible property. And when I followed up with David to ask, how'd your grant turn out? We've been really hoping for a good outcome for you. He completely unsolicited gave me this great testimonial saying that the Conservation Bank called out his application for the Groton project as one of the best he's ever seen, which I think is at least partly the result of your data and document. We did an analysis of the blueprint for him and a letter of support and a number of other things. I think it, meaning user support, is a very valuable service and absolutely helped us get money. So this was a great success story. I want to be very clear that the blueprint and CCAS cannot take credit for this work in any way. So many amazing partners involved in making this happen. The property owners donated a large chunk of its value. We were just happy to play any role, but I think it's a good example of how the blueprint can help make that story a little bit more compelling to funders and really help people accomplish what they're trying to accomplish on the ground for conservation. We have also been increasingly working with some local governments, cities and counties on their comprehensive plans and other planning documents. One place we've worked a good bit is in upstate South Carolina with the Catawba Regional Council of Government. They have been assisting some municipalities with their comprehensive plans. And this is one of those. The town of Fort Mill, South Carolina used the blueprint in its comprehensive plan to help identify habitat cores. And they brought in not just the blueprint, but some of the underlying data as well, like this map that you can see of our upland hardwood birds indicator. And in the text of this chapter, they kind of unpacked in more detail, here are some conservation actions that you might want to take in these areas, places where you might want to improve connectivity, places you might restore riparian buffers, places you might want to avoid fragmenting large cores of intact habitat and those sorts of things. And then lastly, we've done a number of projects and a good bit of work kind of at the intersection of the military mission, working lands, and natural and cultural resource conservation. So I want to hit on a couple of stories under this overall theme. Last year, the Middle Georgia Robins Air Force Base Sustainability Plan was finalized. This is a plan that is intended to kind of promote collaboration and compatible development between the base and the surrounding community. They used the blueprint to identify priority natural areas within a 10-mile buffer around the base. Some of you might be familiar with the Sentinel Landscapes program. The Sentinel Landscapes program is a funding source that funds these big partnerships that work to advance sustainable land management practices with private landowners on areas around military installations. A number of Sentinel Landscapes partnerships have used the blueprint to help support their applications for designation and to identify conservation focus areas. The most recent was the South Carolina Low Country Sentinel Landscapes, which was just approved earlier this year. We've also worked on the Northwest Florida Sentinel Landscape and assisted early on with the Eastern North Carolina Sentinel Landscape as well. The Southeast Regional Partnership for Planning and Sustainability is a big region-wide partnership that's really focused on this area with the military mission and conservation and working lands. They developed what they call their Good Map, which depicts the priorities of many different partners with the goal of identifying overlap between those different areas of interest, and they did incorporate the blueprint into that. And then lastly, there's a project that we've assisted with in North Carolina that is called the Spaces Between the Bases, which I really love that name. They were basically using the blueprint to help map areas around military bases that are important for conservation and working lands, and then taking that a step further to also look at how those areas are likely to be impacted by threats like urban growth and sea level rise, so that the military installations can really plan ahead for how they're going to sustain the ability to achieve their mission in the face of those threats. Just to touch on a couple of other examples before I wrap up, just to give you a sense of kind of the breadth of the issues that Blueprint has helped with over the years. A number of longleaf local implementation teams have used the Blueprint to identify conservation and restoration priorities across the longleaf range. The U.S. Forest Service used the Blueprint to help prioritize their Land and Water Conservation Fund, or LWCF, acquisitions. We've worked with South Carolina and Tennessee to help them align their state wildlife action plans and forest action plans by using the blueprint as sort of a shared data set to identify priorities and kind of help promote coordination across those agencies. The Nature Conservancy and a number of partners in Georgia incorporated the blueprint into their low impact solar siting tool and used the blueprint to basically identify areas that might be more environmentally sensitive and less suitable for utility scale solar energy production. And then lastly, a number of states use the blueprint to identify their priority environmental areas that are at risk of inundation as part of the Army Corps South Atlantic Coastal Study. So those are the success stories and kind of blueprint stories I wanted to share with you all today. I'm going to wrap up by talking about some next steps. So as I said, we're always updating the blueprint year after year, and the focus of this revision is going to be expanding to Puerto Rico and the USVI, as well as the Gulf and Atlantic offshore marine environment. We actually are having workshops in the last 2 weeks of May, and registration is now open to review the draft Blueprint 2023 in those new areas. We would love to have any of you that have expertise in sort of the deeper marine waters or the Caribbean to weigh in and give us your thoughts. You can register on the workshop page of the CCAS website. I also encourage you, if you'd like to learn more or get involved, to join our CCAS newsletter list. I promise we won't blow up your inbox. We only send 2 emails a month. One is our newsletter, which just compiles sort of some blogs about opportunities to get involved, what's the latest with the blueprint. And then we also have a monthly webinar series called the Third Thursday Web Forum. It's held on the third Thursday of every month at 10 a.m. Eastern Time. And it's highlighting exciting science in the world of landscape conservation in the Southeast and Caribbean, the latest updates about the blueprint and opportunities to get involved. And lately, we've also been trying to really promote success stories and lessons learned from conservation practitioners doing work in this region. So with that, I'm going to pause for questions. I always like to leave a lot of room for discussion, but as I told Leslie, I could also do a live demo of some of our online viewers if y'all would like to dig into that a little bit more, so we can just kind of see where the conversation goes. And I'm happy to expand on anything or do that live demo if that's of interest.
Yeah, Hilary, let's go ahead and do the live demo, and then we'll kind of go into questions, because I think it'll be good to see how it works.
Great. Well, let me just pull up my browser window. Is that sharing still working?
Sharing is still working. So
okay, great. So if you want to find the CCAS website and you forget the link, if you just Google CCAS, it will come right up as the first result, Southeast Conservation Adaptation Strategy. As you can see, we're promoting those workshops, so feel free to register. We'd love to have you. If you just go to the blueprint page, you'll see these 3.
We're still seeing your PowerPoint. So
my PowerPoint. Okay, yeah. Let's see. Let me do new share. I couldn't remember if I'd shared my whole screen or my.
No, just that you just share the PowerPoint. So.
Okay, gotcha. Are you seeing my
browser?
Might need
to like kind of close it a little bit this way, your browser, just so it's just narrow it so that it's easier to see. It'll be bigger that way.
That better?
No, I think if you just, so it's pretty wide. That's better now. Yeah, no, it was, and then now it's worse.
Okay.
If you move it from the corner, yeah, just like that. Now we can see it a little bigger. Before it was too small.
Okay. Sorry about that. Okay, so here's the blueprint page. If you scroll down, you'll see these big green buttons that'll direct you to the viewers where you can access the blueprint. I always encourage people to start in the Blueprint Explorer because it's kind of the simplest entry point. On the left side, you'll see some background information on the blueprint, some instructions on how to use the viewer. Here's how to cite the blueprint if you end up using it in a plan or proposal. The viewer basically defaults you into what's called summary mode, and you can see these three modes up at the top. Summary data just summarizes the blueprint by Huck 12 subwatershed on the terrestrial side, and on the marine side by Outer Continental Shelf lease block.
Could you hold on one second? You just could define Huck 12?
Oh, sure. So sorry. Thank you. Huck is a hydrologic unit code, so it's just a definition of a watershed, and there are different definitions, and the Huck 12 is a pretty small one. So these are kind of small watersheds, and if you work in aquatics, it's kind of a common way of chunking up the landscape in an ecologically meaningful way. So basically, as you zoom in, you can see these Huck 12 subwatersheds lighting up, and you can see as I mouse over it that the one I'm over is highlighted in blue. There's also this little find location. I've been giving a lot of love to South Carolina. Let's just keep up with that.
Just a quick question. What do the numbers mean for definition? Does that indicate size or?
Yeah, so basically the more digits your Huck has, the smaller and more granular it is. So like a Huck 2 is like the entire Mississippi River watershed. But by the time you get to the 12 digits, it's getting more and more zoomed in on a particular watershed.
Okay. It was hydrologic unit. What was the last?
Code.
Mm-hmm. I'll put that in the box. Okay.
Yeah, no, good questions. Yeah, so I've typed Conway, South Carolina into the chat or into the location feature, and it's zooming me in to Conway. You can see it's dropped a pin. If I want to get rid of the pin, I just hit the X. So I can select any of these watersheds and it will summarize information about it. So it's telling me how the blueprint priorities break down within that watershed, how much of the watershed is in a hub or a corridor. So you can see the values change as I click around to different watersheds in this area. It also shows which indicators occur in this watershed. So anything that's blue and with a check mark is an indicator that overlaps this watershed in some way. And I can click to learn more about any of them that I'm interested in. So for example, intact habitat cores, if I click it, it gives me some information about what intact habitat cores is and where the data comes from. And then it's showing me what percentage of this watershed is in each of the scores for intact habitat cores. So almost 30% is in a large core, which is greater than 10,000 acres. This area happens to be over Waccamaw River National Wildlife Refuge. So there's a good bit of protected lands in this area along the river. So not surprising that we have some really, really nice big cores of connected natural habitat. If you want to click this link, view this indicator in the CCAS Atlas, this is going to take you to our other viewer, that ArcGIS Online Hub that I mentioned, where you can really view this layer individually and read more about it. How was it developed? What data did we use? What GIS mapping steps do we use to produce it? This is where I get really excited as the comms person about documentation and really trying to be transparent about our methods and how we're using the data that goes into the blueprint. So if I cruise back over to the Explorer, we can learn about any of the other indicators that we're interested in, like resilient terrestrial sites. We can see how resilient to climate change some of these are predicted to be. We could look at some of our aquatic indicators. Since this is along the Waccamaw River, we have a lot of aquatic indicators that are scoring highly here. Like we could look at, for example, natural land cover and floodplains. This is basically looking at kind of riparian buffers and where there's natural vegetated buffers. Again, telling you how those scores break down. There's a threats tab, which is looking at urban growth and sea level rise projections within the area. So in gray, we have past trends from the National Land Cover Data Set, or the NLCD, basically looking at how much of this watershed was urban in 2000, how much was urban in 2019, and then based on urban growth projections, how much is expected to be urban at each of these decades into the future. Sea level rise is sort of a similar thing. It's using data from NOAA's Sea Level Rise Viewer and basically looking at what percent of the watershed is predicted to be inundated at high tide under various sea level rise scenarios. So currently, just at the average highest daily tide in this area, 4.4% of the watershed is predicted to be inundated. But once we get out to 2 feet of sea level rise, we're up to 22%. Once we're up to 6 feet of sea level rise, almost 30%. So just a sense of how sea level rise is likely to impact that area. And then in the partners tab, it's basically just showing the breakdown of the ownership of any conserved lands in that area and what they're being managed for and kind of their level of conservation status. We have this little find a land trust feature. If you click here, it'll show you the land trust within 25 miles of that HUC. And some of them, are based in other areas, but are just working in that area. So that's summary mode. If you want to drill in a little bit more, well, I should say, once you've selected a watershed, if you would like, you can export a report that summarizes everything that I just showed you in the viewer in report form. I'm going to show you one for a custom report in a minute, but it'll basically look just like that. So let me go ahead and jump over to upload shapefile. This is, like I said, my favorite thing. So once you're in the Blueprint Explorer, you just click this upload shapefile button in the upper right. And let's see how quickly I can get to a shapefile that I want to show you. I was talking about Waccamaw River National Wildlife Refuge, so let's just go ahead and run that one. So I just upload my zip file of all of the shapefile little components and then tell it what I want to name the area, and I'll hit create report. And it's pretty quick when you consider how much data it's sifting through, but it might take a little bit. To save time, I'm gonna go ahead and just open the report locally that I've already downloaded. So this is a report for Waccamaw National Wildlife Refuge that I made last month to help with their habitat management plan. And you can kind of see what the report shows you. I also want to highlight this executive summary. So this is the type of thing that user support can do for you. So the automated reports will just leave this page blank. We haven't fully gotten to being able to automate like a human being interpreting all this information. So this is the type of thing that user support can come in and do for you. So if you get your report and you're like, oh my gosh, there's like 50 pages of stuff in here, I kind of don't know where to start. This is the type of thing that we would be happy to help you with and kind of hit the highlights for you and figure out how to translate it. So basically you can see it's given you a map of the blueprint in that area, showing you how the blueprint priority categories break down, map of the hubs and corridors, how the hubs and corridor scores break down. You can see this is a super important area for connectivity. You get this indicator summary that basically works like a table of contents, and it'll jump you around to whichever page you want to look at. Maybe we want to look at amphibian and reptile conservation areas. These are PARCAs, or priority amphibian and reptile conservation areas, that are identified by experts as having a lot of value for amphibians. You can see, almost 40% of this area is within a PARCA, and here's the write-up on that PARCA.
Okay, we're actually just seeing the screen on the internet, not the. Oh
my gosh!
Sorry, I went to open it, so I thought it was still being open.
Let's see. Zoom isn't giving me any way to just share my screen. I have to choose an application. So sorry, I forgot to switch over.
Okay.
That probably.
And if you could zoom in on that, because it's about only, and I'd zoom in about a little bit more, and I go even just a little bit more for everybody. Okay, that's. Yeah. Okay,
so here's the report. Sorry. So here's what that executive summary looks like, that I've sort of summarized. Here's how the blueprint map looks. You can see how the different categories of the blueprint break down within that area of interest.
I'll actually have you pause there for a second, because there was a question about what are low, medium, and high priorities. What are the definitions?
Sure. Yeah, so highest priority areas are those that are most important for that suite of indicators. So basically highest, high, and medium represent, when I talked about that continuous ranking out of zonation, they're basically the top half, the above average areas from that analysis. So they contribute an above average amount to the indicators. So the highest priority is the best of the best, is the top 10% of the analysis. High priority is a little bit below that, it's the 15% underneath it. And then the medium priority is everything else above 50%. And then the priority connections are basically the portions of the connectivity analysis. So these are corridors that weren't already prioritized earlier in the analysis. So they're kind of the other important areas for connectivity.
So is every unit, it's compared against itself for priority, or is it compared against, like, is this background data? So you could have an area that's all in highest priority, or could you have an area like, or is it change each time you select a unit?
No, it does not change. It's okay. Standard comparison within, like within each subregion. So it's basically saying, like, in this area within, what would this be? Probably the Central Coastal Plain subregion, the highest and high and medium compared to other areas of that subregion. So yeah, when you're running a report, it's basically just slicing up part of that static map. It's not like doing a new prioritization on the fly for your area or anything like that. That's a good question. It might be easiest to show you. I got to switch my sharing mode back, but if I go back to the viewer, we do have some better definitions probably of what I just said. So here you can see, yeah, where conservation action would make the biggest impact based on the indicators, covers 10%. High priority, make a big impact, it's 15%. Medium priority is another 20%. So this covers 45, and then priority connections brings in another 5%. I don't know if that's maybe too technical, but that's how they're defined.
That makes sense.
Okay. Yeah, so that's the blueprint. And then the corridors map. This is kind of the connectivity analysis that's underneath the hood of the blueprint. So you can see the hubs, the corridors, how much of this analysis area has been recognized for its connectivity importance, and how that breaks down in a table. And then here's the, oh shoot, I got to share again. Gosh, Teams is not like this. I use Teams every day and I'm just in Teams mode. Let me switch back to my PDF.
Okay.
So yeah, here's this indicator summary table where you can see all of the indicators that occur in this analysis area. So anything that you're interested in, you can click to learn more about. Like I mentioned, these South Atlantic amphibian and reptile conservation areas. This is an indicator of places important for our herps. And you can see this lower section has been recognized as a parka. Almost 40% of it falls within this priority amphibian and reptile conservation area. And then this is an indicator that has kind of, because it's sort of based on expert feedback on important areas for amphibians, has some like descriptions of what is this important for, what are the amphibians that occur there. And so this is something you could weave into a proposal, or from the perspective of a refuge, maybe these are some species they should be monitoring for, or be managing habitat for. And yeah, as you scroll through, you just see maps and analysis of basically all of the indicators that occur in this area. Here are some of our aquatic indicators. Like I said, this is the Waccamaw River, so there's a lot of floodplain in here. You can see how all of this is scoring.
Can you scroll a little slower just because it's hard to, no one can really read the.
Sure.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, so here's natural land cover and floodplains. This is what we looked at in the viewer, looking at sort of those intact riparian buffers. And a table of how those scores break down. And then I'm going to skip to the end and show you the threat map. So I know I'm flying here, but here's the, for example, let's look at sea level rise. So this is that sea level rise map. So you can see that this is all very much in an area likely to be impacted by sea level rise. And then
I'm sorry, just what was the time zone for that? Is that current?
So yeah, this is, so the sea level rise inundation scenarios from NOAA actually aren't linked to time. They're not saying you'll get here in 2040. They're just saying when you get to 2 feet of sea level rise, whenever that is, here's what will be inundated. And so the 0 is current 0 feet of sea level rise. So that's like at high tide now, or now, whatever this analysis was, which I think was like 2019 maybe. And then going out to 1 feet, 2 feet, 3 feet, out to 10, what would be inundated at high tide. So the deeper waters are, the deeper colors of blue are like what would be most underwater by the time you get to those. higher scenarios. But where we can bring in time, this is something that's new for this year. Trying to figure out the Zoom so you can kind of see it. So NOAA's sea level rise data doesn't have the time, but they do have some sea level rise projections that get to time. So for example, let's say Waccamaw is interested in like the 2 foot of sea level rise scenario. By the time they hit 2 feet, 68% of that refuge is going to be inundated at high tide. Well, when are they likely to hit 2 feet? Well, we can go to NOAA's sea level rise report data and figure that out. So 2 feet under a high emissions scenario where sea level is rising a lot, we could be at a 2.2 feet by 2060. But at some of these lower scenarios, you know, we haven't even hit sea level rise out to 2100. So this can give you a sense of like, when do I need to be worrying about these scenarios? Yeah, and then similar things for urban growth. Just for time, I think I'll close out the report and just show you a couple more things on the viewer. Let me reshare here, I'm getting the hang of it. So that was sort of our summary mode and reports. We also have a couple of other modes. One is pixel data, and pixel data is really designed to allow you to zoom in on the smallest unit of the analysis, which is a pixel. So for those of you who might not be super familiar with raster-based data, this is just a type of data that depicts the landscape as a grid of these tiny equally sized cells. Each cell is a pixel, and the smaller your pixel, the finer the resolution of your data. So the blueprint is at a 30 meter by 30 meter pixel, which, to give you a sense, that's a pixel of about a 1/4 acre in that analysis. So we can zoom in on your area of interest. I'm going to head towards southern Missouri and Mark Twain National Forest. And basically what the viewer is doing is pinpointing the pixel that's in the center of this little bullseye. Staff often call this pixel hunter because of the little crosshairs. So whatever pixel's in the middle here is the one it's going to report on. So it's telling you things like what priority class is it in. It's kind of boring. I can see that from the legend, but it's telling me underneath this, there's a hub. So this is actually an area that's really important for connectivity. And similarly in the indicators, now we can really pinpoint. Each pixel only has one score for a particular indicator. So what is the specific pixel scoring? We can see that it's scoring really highly on fire frequency. It's getting the highest score, and I can click to learn more and see that this has been burned more than 3 or more times since between 2013 and 2021. And this is near national forest land, so not surprising. They're doing a lot of good burning out here. And so as I can kind of cruise around, you can see how the value changes because I'm selecting a different pixel to report on. And similar things for threats, you know, we don't get as many cool charts because it's just telling us about one pixel instead of an area, but it's telling me this particular area isn't likely to urbanize. If I cruise around, I bet I can trip an urbanized pixel though, because there's probably some roads around here, yeah. They're just really narrow. Yeah, so there was an urban 2019 that just flashed on. There's probably a road under here somewhere. And then partners, yeah, this is not an area that's conserved, but if I go back down here into the national forest, you'll see that this is federally owned, managed for multiple uses, which is what you'll often see with Forest Service lands. Once you're into pixel data, you can do some cool stuff and actually change the layer that you're viewing with this little toggle up here on the right. So I can look at the hubs and corridors underneath the blueprint. So when I was over here, it showed I was in a hub. So now you can actually see the hubs layer on the map. We could look at some of the indicators that we're interested in, maybe back to fire frequency, and see, yeah, here's that area where all this great burning is happening. I can put the blueprint back on here. The newest feature, I don't know whether I totally have time to get into this, but it's called pixel filters. And the idea here is that you're able to select a subset of the blueprint that meets whatever criteria you want to set. So let's say that you want to just look at the best class of the blueprint, just show me highest priority. Well, I can filter it until all I see is the highest priority class. Similarly, I could filter just by hubs and corridors. I only want to see areas of the blueprint that are in the connectivity analysis. Well, I can do that. You can also mix and match these filters in whatever way you'd like. And the thing to remember as you do that is that they're considered and filters, which means they show places that meet that criteria and that criteria and that criteria. So if you imagine, like, say I'm on Zappos and I'm shopping for shoes, I need a new pair of hiking boots or something. I might select a bunch of filters. I might say, I want my size, I want them to be waterproof, I want it to be a hiking boot. Well, I don't want things that meet one of those criteria. I want them to meet all of them, because otherwise I'm going to get high heels and shoes that aren't in my size. And so I'm looking for all of those criteria to be met. And that's how these filters work. So let's say that I want to see something like areas that I could do riparian buffer restoration. So I'm going to choose the natural land cover and floodplains indicator. And I don't want to look at the stuff that's in the best score for this indicator because that doesn't need restoration. So I'm going to exclude it down to just this lower range. But maybe that's not enough for me. Maybe I want to look at areas where my riparian buffer restoration would also benefit birds in the Mississippi alluvial valley. Well, I can select this reforestation indicator for Mississippi alluvial valley forest birds. And you can see it's really getting restrictive about the parts of the blueprint that it's highlighting. The idea here is that this allows you to find your piece of the blueprint, the part of the blueprint that aligns with what you want to accomplish. So I'll probably stop there with the demo so we have time for a few questions, but that's kind of a quick crash course in how the Blueprint Explorer works.
Great. Thank you so much, Hilary. This is quite a robust tool. It is hard to cover how much it can do in this time.
I just did an hour web forum just dedicated to the viewers like last month. So like, I got to speed up.
No problem. So there was a question, who funded the development of the blueprint and sustains the work? I think you mentioned it briefly, but we can.
Yeah, that's a great question. We're very lucky to be funded by the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. So they provide our staff and our funding for things like the viewer. The viewer itself is developed by a software developer named Brendan Ward. His company is called Astute Spruce, and he's really incredible. But yeah, the majority of our funding comes from the Fish and Wildlife Service.
That's great. And there was a question about, who came up with the indicators. So was there a lot of stakeholder engagement in that effort, or was that defined largely by like federal, state agencies in the what they've already got engaged? And along those lines, someone was also curious if some of this data comes from the NRCS Natural Resource Inventory.
I think we've used some NRCS data in the past. And an indicator of grassland restoration, looking at like enrollment in conservation reserve grassland enhancement programs. I'm not sure whether we're using any other direct data from NRCS right now. In terms of the indicators, yeah, it's kind of a mix of feedback from folks on what they think is important and what needs to be represented. For example, at our last workshop series, we got some great feedback from folks out in the Great Plains that we were really missing these playas, these seasonal depressions that help recharge the aquifers and are really important places for wildlife out on the plains. And so we were able to develop a indicator based on data from the Playa Lakes joint venture to help fill that niche. Some are just kind of based on basic science of like landscape planning, patch size and connectivity. And but there's a lot of sort of input from the agencies involved in CCAS, a lot of input from the broader conservation community, and then just us as staff kind of looking at the places we know and consulting with experts and being like, hey, we really need to better represent this aspect or that aspect.
That's great. There's also a question just kind of about what the extent of the data is. So for example, I know you dipped into Missouri. So how far does this data go?
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Great question. Yeah, so our geography is based on the Southeastern Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies, because that's the group that really started CCAS. So basically we cover all of the CAFWA states, which is a 15-state depiction of the Southeast. And then with this new, and they also cover Puerto Rico and USVI and CAFWA as well. And with this new approach for 2023, we're expanding to basically the extent of US waters along the US and the Gulf of Mexico. And in Puerto Rico and USVI for our Caribbean update this year, we weren't quite able to get all the data we needed to do like deep marine. So we're more just doing kind of a shallower water marine around Puerto Rico and USVI. We do have some kind of sister initiatives in other parts of the US, like there's a Nature's Network that covers the Northeast, and that's also been a Fish and Wildlife Service supported effort. There's a group called the Midwest Landscape Initiative, or MLI, that covers the Midwest, and they've actually just come up with their sort of first generation blueprint. So, but CCAS is basically just, maybe show my slide as a better depiction of it from the beginning.
There's also a question about, do the Viewer Explorer map services have any option for base maps, example, like an image or topograph?
Sure. Yeah, that's a good question. The Blueprint Explorer, I shouldn't have switched, does have an imagery-based map. So you can, and if the base map is in your way, let me make this smaller again, to make it easier to see. You can always turn off the blueprint, turn it back on. So yeah, you have your choice of the gray or the imagery, basically, in the viewer.
Great. There's also a question of, do areas get lower priority ranking when protected lands are common and extensive because they're already protected? So if you have one of your units, I guess the smaller regions, and there's many high priority lands, and how are they ranked?
The short answer is no. Protected lands don't really influence the prioritization outside of the connectivity analysis. So it's really just based on how the indicators are scoring. So an area that has a lot of protected land may actually score really highly in the blueprint because it has a lot of areas that are in really good ecological condition and are kind of coming to the top of that prioritization. We have indicators that are more geared toward restoration as well, but the idea is that, protected lands, you can't just protect them and forget them. They need to be managed. And so because the blueprint is about a lot more than land acquisition, it's also about management, restoration, those sorts of things. Protected lands don't get any special status, but they also don't really get any special penalty.
Okay. There's also another question about data, but is joint venture data, or the acronym is LMVJV?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm so excited to be able to say yes to that question because we just incorporated their data last year for the first time. So yeah, the Lower Mississippi Valley Joint Venture, the LMVJV, we incorporate I think 3 of their data sets.
What is the joint venture data? I just asked the question, so I don't actually know what that means.
Oh yeah, so the joint venture, they're bird partnerships.
Okay.
Actually, they're not that different from CCAS in that they're rallying, and they've been around a lot longer. They rallied partners around, but mostly just bird conservation, whereas CCAS is kind of trying to do birds and aquatics and other things and working kind of at a bigger scale, but very, very complementary. And we do rely on the JVs enormously to make sure that we're representing birds correctly in the blueprint. So let me zoom in a little bit and grab, actually what I will do is I'll use my little layer toggle and I'll turn it on for you. So we have 2 indicators straight out of the Lower Mississippi Valley Joint Venture, their protection model for Mississippi Alluvial Valley forest birds. So areas where land protection would particularly benefit those birds. And then also their reforestation model, places where reforestation would really benefit that suite of interior forest breeding birds. I believe they also are the data provider for the West Coastal Plains and Ouachita's forested wetland bird model, which we incorporate for a slightly different bird conservation region. And then for the West Coastal Plains and Ouachita's open pine birds as well. And another data set that we want to try to incorporate in our next update for the contiguous US is black rail data from the Atlantic Coast Joint Venture too. But yeah, the LMVJV was a big focus of getting their data in last year. So I'm so glad you asked that question. Thank you.
It was not my question, but we have another question of what is the ultimate end use or purpose of gathering all of this data?
It's really to just at that broadest scale, achieve the CCAS vision and help people connect the lands and waters of the Southeast. It's all about just, kind of helping the conservation community work together to coordinate our efforts and trying to make sure that at the end of the day, everything that we're doing is adding up to something bigger, something more meaningful than we could achieve on our own, so that we can keep pace with all of the big scary threats out there.
Sounds good. And then we have the last question here is there any interest in getting more granularity around goals for improving connectivity? For example, some amount of riparian buffers in agricultural lands versus amounts of new acres protected.
That is an excellent question. I think our science coordinator, Rua, would be super excited about that one, actually. That would be something we would love to get more granular with in the CCAS goal report. I didn't really get into that, but I could show you in 1 minute. I know this line needs to be repurposed after this, but we have a report that, like I said, tracks progress on all those indicators toward the CCAS goal. And so we would love to incorporate some more granular connectivity metrics in here. We have some aquatic connectivity and we have undeveloped land in the corridors. So, how much of the corridors are in a natural state, but those are two really good ideas for ways to measure connectivity across the region.
Great. Okay, well, I think there is a comment in the chat about the lower Mississippi Valley has 700,000 acres of wetland reserve easements that are all owned by NRCS and all protected. And awesome. Then the open pine model of that, of the WGCP under that larger lower Mississippi Valley joint venture is now being implemented in East Texas as well.
Oh, that's awesome. That's fantastic.
Great. Well, I want to thank Hilary so much for presenting to us, and this recording will be available at the same location as the original webinar. And I'm sorry that I was not able to get the captions working. And as you can see, Hilary is available to help you because there's a wealth of information here. And lastly, for those of you who are getting continuing education credits for this class, I'm sorry, for this webinar, make sure you finish the webinar portal process. You want to click the orange button on the other screen. So thanks, everybody.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, a lot of great questions.
Hi, everybody.
Bye, Hilary.